evening, everyone. I'm well aware that I could have been addressing an empty room, so I'm very grateful that all the efforts everyone made to get here. It's certainly more interesting for me. Thank you so much for that very generous introduction, and thank you to Gary too. I'd also, just before I begin, just like to express my gratitude to the American Academy and the staff here who've been extraordinarily supportive. It's the most amazing group of fellows here too. I can't tell you what interesting breakfasts I've had ever since I've been living here. So I'm going to talk briefly about the early work, but mostly I'll be talking about the work in the last 10 years. But I just want to catch up with, or rather put in context, the line describing a cone piece, which is when I began making art, I was making performances. The performances were made with small fires, and they took place in map references in the middle of nowhere. And when you do performances, particularly performances in the back and beyond, brings up the question of documentation. And I realized that the way to deal with the problem is to make a film, but I had never made a film before. And so my first film was Landscape for Fire, which was a 7.5-minute kind of documentary, really, although it turned into something a little different. But that was the piece that I actually took round and showed to friends and colleagues in galleries and alternative spaces. And I became aware that there was a problem, which is that for me, the work of art was the performance. And I was showing a document that was a secondary document, and it was twice removed from the original object, which interested me, the performance. Twice removed because the fire performance had taken place elsewhere, somewhere other than the room where it was being projected. And it was taking place in the past. And I began to ask the question if it was possible to make a film that existed in the present. And so line describing was my response to that problem. And I don't think I need to go any more into it, except to say that, to reiterate the fact that it existed, the film only existed at the moment of projection, a moment that it shared with the audience, and in a place that was shared, a space that was a shared space. That's the original film shot of it being shown in Artist Space in New York in 1974. That was its first performance. So I continued making fire pieces, however, and it created some new difficulties. One of them was that when you work with fire, it is rather a spectacular medium, and so people came expecting a show with a narrative structure, and had an assembled audience. They were expecting some kind of shape, which was a dramatic shape, whereas I felt that I was making a sculptural event, of which they were a witness. So it was a very different idea about what I was doing, and that was when I made two discoveries. And I'm talking about this because it comes forward right into the present with me now. One discovery was that if you expand the scale of a work, it becomes something that incorporates the spectator. And so there's no object which can be looked at from a distance, but you're inside the object. So you surround the observer spatially. The other was the discovery that the reason why people have expectations when they come to a show is because that's what shows are. If you have a 20-minute work or a 1-hour work, you expect, first of all, an assembled audience, and you expect that there's a kind of dramatic shape to it. If, on the other hand, you extend the duration of the work over, well, all day, you no longer have an audience, but you have visitors that come individually, and they come and go as they please and give as much time as they want to. So which, if you think about it, is actually very much like looking at sculpture. But the idea of incorporating the spectator in a field and also having a durational structure that means that people come and go, you get rid of that problem. And I ported that idea over into the next fire piece I made, which was called Long Film for 4 Projectors. Sorry, the next solid light work. I'm so sorry. As you can see, if you're in that, if you go into that room, you're inside the film. You cannot look away from it. You're inside it. So it's a field in which, a spatial field in which the whole event occurs in different directions. And it was, the minimum cycle of this work was 5.5 hours. So people came and they went. And I suppose this was my beginning of what's now called installation, the idea of an extended time in an altered space. And these ideas I think I'm still working through, in fact. Here it is in an installation. And the following year I made 4 projected movements. And you have a single blade of light which takes 15 minutes to turn through 90 degrees. It's very, very simple. It's a sort of distillation of long film for projectors. I think for my purposes today, what's important about the film is that, for me, is that it positions the projector on the floor in the corner of the space and projects along the wall, so that there's an engagement with the architecture of the space, such that the movements are played out against the floor and the wall and the body of the spectator, it should be said. And then finally, I'd like you to notice the arrow. It's a cyclical structure, and this is when I developed the idea of the cycle. Cycle is something that in which, I mean, the internal structure and its extension through the day are closely linked. It's not the same thing as a loop, which can be anything that you just repeat. So cyclical structure is something that I'm also still, is basically a fundamental of the more recent work. Oh, and there it is, sorry. There it is, that was taken at Sproetmager's earlier in the year, when we showed the early work. And you see this great big plane of light, and the spectator's looking toward the projector, which is on the floor. And that was taken at Columbia Architectural School, has a gallery there, and we showed it there for a month or so, some years back. Okay, so now I want to fast forward 20, 25 years. I had by this time, so when I started again, I looked back at the early work and I had a formal vocabulary of basically straight lines and circles. And the first new work I made, I discovered the travelling wave. Travelling waves are a very interesting form because you have continuous motion. We're looking at two cinema frames, basically, okay? And this is the image on the wall, the travelling wave. And you basically have continuous motion. You have continuous change because the line is changing height relative to someone looking. It has many, many variations, like you're inside a mountain or underwater or something, you're in a trough over there, and the figure on the right has got a diagonal form passing through the body. So it keeps addressing the scale of the body repeatedly. Let's say it takes 10 minutes to cross the frame. The thing is, it just keeps going. So you have continuous motion, continuous change, but no narrative development, which seems like just the perfect form to me. Plus that way it addresses scale in the body. So the first new work I made was called Doubling Back. And this is a drawing I made at the time when I was trying to explain to someone how the structure worked. If you look at the top part there, what you have is you have a traveling wave moving sideways through the space. It takes maybe 10 minutes to cross the frame. And then you have an identical traveling wave traveling vertically through it. Now, if they're both going at the same speed, as you can see, it begins to produce. I'm using color, by the way, only to keep it clear which wave is which. But you see it produces different shapes and forms and volumes, which, of course, play out in 3 dimensions, as you'll see. Here's the actual lines on a screen grab from one of the frames. You can see the horizontal one and the vertical one going down. Here's a drawing. Now, I picked up the idea from 4 projected movements 30 years earlier, putting the projector in the corner and projecting along the wall. And in this case, you have these curvilinear forms, and they sort of fold and unfold against the floor and the walls of the space. Here are a group of drawings. I think each drawing is about 3 minutes apart. And you can see how the form begins to open up. It opens up completely, then it turns around in itself, and then it closes up. It's called doubling back, and so that's a 15-minute movement. The second 15-minute movement is for it to return, so it in fact goes backwards and ends up in this position. So again, a cyclical structure with a cycle time of 30 minutes, which continues ad infinitum. This is a shot from inside the piece. The thing that occurs when people look at the work is, of course, they interrupt it. And you can have quite a lot of people in there interrupted a lot. And so sometimes there is a difficulty and a challenge in looking at them, because it's a performative, these works are all performative in the sense that you're not only looking at planes of light and my temporal structure, you're also looking at what other people are doing. And so that becomes that reciprocity between the people looking and the object means that you can go and see the same piece on different days and have a completely different sense of what it is. Here's a piece from the outside. This was shot at the Whitney Biennial in 2004. Now, at this point, a train of thought was beginning to develop. I was still interested in material questions of light, duration, so on, and interested in the way that duration can affect an audience, and all those things I carried forward. But I had a new interest in the possibility of representing the body, of representing the corporeal. And I mean, obviously not in any pictorial sense. And my understanding at the time, or the understanding I came to about a body, was that it doesn't really make any sense to think of a body as a thing in itself. Bodies only make sense when they're in a state of exchange with other bodies. And I decided that that was quite an interesting possibility, was to try to find a way to describe that state of exchange. Now, how could this state of exchange be represented? And I found an answer in an archaic piece of cinematic syntax called the wipe, which was a kind of a slow cut. It was done at the time, the 40s and the 50s particularly, because it was felt that people didn't necessarily understand that when you made a cinematic cut, you went from one scene to another, there had been a change of time and place, and it was a way of marking a shift, basically nudging you and saying, get it, we've just changed something. And I'm going to show you, I found an example online. Kurosawa used it to great effect, and I'm going to show you a little clip. It's so good, I've got to see that again. Let's see. Oh. So basically, the one image slowly covers the other. Well, slowly, half a second, covers over the other and is a marker of the change. What interested me was that during that transition, you had two forms in relation to one another. And I thought, well, what if that half a second transition is 10 minutes or 15 minutes? And what if that transition is all there is? What if it became, the white became the entire piece? So here are my building blocks, because of course I now need two terms, I've decided, in this train of thought. And my two forms are an elliptical form, which what its behavior is that it expands and contracts. So it contracts to about half of its height and then expands again quite slowly. The other form is made of two forms, in fact. We've got the traveling wave, which we've already discussed, which is taking 10 minutes to go across the frame. And then there's a straight line, which is behaving very much like a plank floating on the ocean. So it goes, down, and then it changes angle as the wave hits it, and it comes up. And then it changes angle again, and then it goes down. Now, what's interesting to me about that is, like the wave, it's addressing the height of the body, because it's, in effect, the light is going up and down your body. And changing angle, which is profoundly different, a plane of light going down the room like that is profoundly different from one like that. So that's my little vocabulary, okay? And so now I want to show you you're going to recognize it. I want to show you exactly 60 seconds from a piece I made called You and I, Horizontal, which, by the way, is a horizontal film with a projector at one end and one single big screen at the other. And you'll see all these things in play. And the thing about it is, you notice the one thing you can't see is the wipe. You can see its effect. In fact, the wipe is slowly moving in that direction. It's an invisible edge you can't see. So, in effect, the circular form is slowly invading the other, and they're engaged in this kind of dance. And they're each doing what they do, but they're brought together by the agency of the wipe. And you must also imagine that this is extended as a volumetric form to the end of the room, and the form is double this size, and you're inside it, and you're looking down these planes of light and moving your own body around as these bodies are moving around you. So let's stop. That's the end of the clip. The important thing to say now is, I've described, the internal workings of a cinematic structure, but in fact, when you're looking at it, you're inside it. You're engaging what feels like a sculptural form, and whenever you're looking at it, the form is absolutely complete. So it's a sculptural form, complete at every moment, but it's mutating very slowly, as you've seen. And so it becomes, the eternal presence in a way, an idea also that I began to think about in the 70s. So that was you and I, horizontal. The next piece I want to talk about is called breath. And I want to talk about it primarily because of its verticality. So we just were discussing a projected work that was 10 meters across. This is a work that's 10 meters up or down. And it has a similar, some of the same vocabulary. It has, a traveling wave, which this time incorporates an elliptical form, which is expanding and contracting. And the vertical works are very different from the horizontal for lots of reasons. For one thing, you can approach them from all sides. For another thing, and this is actually quite a profound difference, you can't block the light like you can with the horizontal work. It has, perhaps it's disengaging itself a little from the cinematic history, the traditional cinematic format of a horizontal projection. And by becoming vertical, it, in some ways, suggests the sculptural more emphatically than the cinematic. Certainly, I quickly began to refer to these as standing figures. I caught myself doing it, but it's quite interesting, sculpture being traditionally about the figure. But I think it also evokes some architectural references, which have to do with walls and apertures and doorways and enclosures. So it's very simple. It's simply a traveling wave that's passing through the frame, and there is a static elliptical form which is expanding and contracting horizontally. So it goes from being a circle to an ellipse and back again. There are some rules of engagement which mean that certain lines cannot be seen. So I'm going to show a clip of this too. It's a shorter one than before, but it's important because this business of representing the body, becomes quite obvious here. Just a shot of the. So when you walk into that space, it's a very charged space, and it is as if you're inside something alive or something breathing in a way. But you're also in a room, and it's very interesting to see when people look at these. This work was in the Hamburger Bun Wolf show, Breath number 3. It's very interesting how people, not only do they always reach out to touch the membranes, so it's rather tactile in that sense, but they also show enormous amount of respect for the wall. So a friend will appear from over there in the distance, and I've seen other people walk around to go and meet them. I think it's really interesting that they can treat something that's completely immaterial as a wall. So now I want to look at a piece called Between You and I. This is a double vertical. And it's not only an object made of the fusion of two forms, because also as doing this wipe with the two forms that are having an interaction within the conical object. But there are also two objects. So this time you have two sets of wipes going on simultaneously. And this is a sense, this slide gives you a sense of the space, the business of being able to walk into them or to be enclosed. But notice the distance between them. It's about 9 meters from the foot of it to the far edge. And so when you go to investigate what's going on the other one, you leave the other one behind. So there's always something you don't know. There's always something you're having to guess at. And this may help explain that. So here are the footprints every 3 minutes. Okay, 3 minutes going like this all the way down. Now you can see, let's follow the logic of the top one. We begin with our traveling wave bisected by a line. And then with the wipe is gradually causing the elliptical form to enter the space of the other. And as you follow the space along, you can see that the wipe is progressing more and more until at the end it's become a full ellipse. And you can also see in that line, top line, how the shapes are changing. You can see the ellipse expanding and contracting. So this idea of every form having its own independent behavior, but through the agency of the wipe, they're brought together into a single complex whole. And then you just get the opposite down here, where you begin with the ellipse, and the invading form is the traveling wave coming up to the end. So in sculptural terms, what happens is they simply change places. Two sides change places. This is taken in disused church on Governor's Island in New York, and this is between you and I, looked at from the side. And I included it because, thing about these works, I think horizontal and vertical, you notice it particularly with the vertical, because they come like dwelling places where people hang out. It's very social space, and people talk to one another, to people they don't know, it's both intimate and social at the same time, which I think is part of the way they signify. And this whole idea of representing the corporeal is a formal idea. It's not really an image idea. So this intimacy and slowness and tactile quality and companionship with strangers is all, I think, part of the way it signifies. And this is an installation view of the Hamburger Bun Wolf exhibition, I think 3 years ago, 2012, where in the Great Hall the historic hall, we had a whole series of vertical works that were flanked at each end by horizontal works. So this one in the foreground is called Meeting You Halfway, then there's Breath 3, which you just saw, and then you have the double work between you and I, and so on. Again, it shows there's a sort of sense of people milling about. It's very quiet. There's a murmuring going on. It's a kind of it's a sort of unique atmosphere, social atmosphere. So the final solid light piece I want to talk about tonight is a fairly recent one, horizontal, called Face to Face. And this is the first time that I've come in from the walls. Don't touch the walls at all. It's happening in the middle of the space. And also the first time where I have projectors facing opposite directions. Well, actually, long film before projectors was doing that, but in a slightly different way. So here's an installation view shot at Sean Kelly Gallery in New York. This was the beginning of this year. The screens are double screens, so you can see them read them from both sides, translucent, and the projectors are on the floor. Now, what I want to, I think there's a pointer here somewhere. Here we are. Notice how, let's see. Yes, let's look at this form, the traveling wave and the straight line. The other half of that travelling wave in straight line is here. So the displacement across 10 meters or more of the two forms. So if you carry this line on, it's here. And if you want to continue this travelling wave, it's here. And so you get a fracturing of the image across space and actually time, because one is simply 15 minutes ahead of the other. Now, facing in two directions and having double screens, I hit the limit of what I could imagine on it with drawings on a notebook or in my mind's eye. I'm pretty good at visualizing things, but when you get double 3D like this and across time as well, it's pretty hard to think about. So I found that making a paper maquette was really useful, and because you can hold it in your hand, turn it round. And the complicated thing about this work is, well, the things that are really simple and we know so well, I've got in front of me and I have behind me. I can't see behind me, I can see you. I have my left and I have my right. That's simple enough until you turn around and find that your left is now your right and your right's now your left. And these are the kinds of things that get engaged in this piece. And with a 3D drawing like this, you see again, you can see how this form joins up with this one, again. What this means is that when you're, let's see, I think maybe I can do this with the next slide. No, maybe on this one. When you're inside the volumetric form, that's the footprint of which is this curve, and it goes right down here. When you're inside that volumetric form, looking back toward the projector, your back to the image, you can see through the veils of light, you can see this form, which completes the form graphically that you're in volumetrically. Am I clear? Yeah. Which is a very strange feeling. You're doing a translation from the, as it were, from the graphic to the three-dimensional while you're experiencing a three-dimensional object, and it's quite interesting sort of difficulty that you have. So in the end, this is really the 3D equivalent of the between you and I footprints we were looking at, the black and white drawings that are framed on the wall. And this is how I work the film out. Of course, you can see the progression. So you begin with a complete ellipse. The ellipse is of course contracting. The wipe has kicked in, moved across there. The wipe is now halfway across. So we have a complex form made of two halves of two different objects, and so on. And then same thing on this side. You begin with a traveling wave bisected by the line, and then see, run out of batteries. Oh no, it's my finger. Okay, sorry. You have the elliptical form through the agency of the wipe is entering the traveling wave form and gradually taking it over. And we've done some fancy footwork by flipping one of the images so that these correspondences are possible. Because, if you project something over here and then you project the same thing over there, everything's on the wrong side. But if you flip one of them, you kind of make a correction which makes possible a direct comparison between the two. And here is another installation view. And it's very easy to see, this joins up with that. And these two are also part of the same thing. But you can also see the difference between, walking into the volumetric form or looking at the graphic form. And you walk around this space and there's no right thing to look at. In a way, this is the first work I've made in which everything is equal. With the earlier pieces, I think I thought of the footprint on the wall as something behind you, and the main event was the sculptural volumetric object. But I sort of got over that, and this is actually quite challenging. It's enjoyably challenging, but I mean it's quite a riddle that you can't quite resolve. I'd like to just finish by, I mean, I've been picking and choosing carefully, and so I haven't given an account of everything, obviously. But one of the things I've been doing for the past few years is making proposals, usually invited to make proposals for works that are not in galleries but in public spaces somewhere. And I thought I would just show you one, which is unrealized, cough, cough. And the proposal was made for a bridge in upstate New York called the Poughkeepsie Railroad Bridge, which is a couple of kilometers across and quite high. It was a disused bridge at the time. Now it's become a public park, rather like the High Line. It's the most incredible views from up there. Anyway, my proposal called for all the struts of the superstructure to be lined with a single string of white LED lights that could be programmed. And I proposed to light the bridge, very, very, illuminating it very, very gradually. So there's a drawing showing the lighting of the bridge. Now, that takes 6 months. So that's a 2 meters a night progression. I like this idea of a work being embedded in the life of a community rather than being something you actively know you're looking at. It becomes folded into your daily life. So here's the full structure. So this idea of lighting the bridge is now tied with the idea of unlighting it. So you have 6 months to light it, and then after 6 months, it begins again, moving in the same direction from left to right, which of course depends on which bank you're standing on or which side of the bridge. Moves from left to right and until it's completely dark. And so that's mapped onto the calendar. So when it's getting most fully lit, the nights are getting longer and longer, because it begins in midsummer and at dark, and then it gradually is lit up until it's fully lit in December. And then it immediately begins unlighting, so that by the time it's dark again, the nights are actually very short. And it's the idea, it's a perpetual structure. It would last forever, which I'm told is 10 years. And it through a series of, I mean, it's rather sad, the person who was going to commission it and who made these kind of projects happen died. So the bridge, lacking its person who would be able to realize the project like that by raising the money, pulled out. But it in fact could be on any trestle bridge, anywhere. Again, cough, cough. So I think let's leave it there. Thank you. I'll be happy to take any questions or talk with it. I think we're...
So the first thing, of course, now, up till the end of December, Gary, the mayor of New York has to come here. And he has to see this work, which is perhaps by my introduction for this small conversation we'll be having for roughly 10 minutes or something, I suppose, is the relation to architecture. It became most evident here now in your talk. And when I think back now to 2008, when we had the U&I horizontal in the notation show. And the notation show was called Notation, Calculus, and Forms in the Arts of the 20th Century. And with architecture by Cedric Price, and Mark Wigley is here as well, Beatrice is there, and Peter Eisman and others. Your work has a clear relation to the scale of the human being. Is this correct?
Yeah. Yes, the scale is Vitruvian Man, you know. It's,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's not the modulor. It's not the modulor by Corbusier. It is
Right. No.
I mean, but in all your works, and you just showed this in one of the last projects, it is the way the human being may move through space and encounters, in fact, a wall that is a threshold. So your walls of light are thresholds to trespass, where you can go through, which is the most sensual experience, and it seems to be an experience which is just the contrary of any power play. I mean, here, of course, in Berlin, you may think of the light domes,
Yeah.
and you think of the light as an expression of power. And the way you are inserting light or using light as the very essence of your artistic work, it seems like giving possibilities to the human being and not considering him or her as a spectator, but as somebody trespassing.
Well, I'm not sure if I need to respond to that, actually, but I mean...
Well, you can.
No, well, the thing is, you know, there's a sense of order in the works, which, you know, I don't know how much I'm responsible for, you know. I don't think about issues like that while I'm making a work, you know. It's an intuitive process.
Wait, I mean...
That's a cop-out, I know, but I can't.
Sorry?
It's a cop-out, I know, but it's a tough question to answer, to respond to.
Okay, then let's go one step back first, and this is more the question: when you quit consciously or not, I suppose consciously, the arts in the late 70s, and you're concentrating on book work, on pages, and on the work of other artists. The moment where you came back in the end of the 90s, how did this happen? What was the moment which brought you back?
It was a series of things, really. I mean, first of all, in the 70s, this work was, on the whole, not represented by galleries. It was called avant-garde cinema, and it had its own institutions and absolutely no economic structure whatsoever. And one was mostly making work and showing it to your colleagues, you know, to other filmmakers. And that was pretty much, it was a small but quite intense culture, actually. But it was impossible to make a living from it. So when I was about 31, I realized that I'd probably made a bad career move. And I figured out some ways to, I mean, I had been trained as a graphic designer. So I began doing that, and which just gradually sort of took over my time. I mean, the 80s, suddenly there was a huge boom. Neo-expressionism was the star form, and selling like hotcakes. And of course, it generated a lot of catalogues. So the irony was that the movement that brought painting back so dramatically also killed a lot of conceptual practices that were around at the time. Well, buried them, really. The market buried them. But of course, it had provided quite a lot of employment for a graphic design studio. So that was odd. But I never voted to stop making art, but I did find that it was necessary to be absolutely invisible, since I was in the middle of the art world still. And then certain preconditions occurred, which certain things happened, which made a return possible. One was, of course, the entry of video art into the art world, center of the art world. By the early 90s, video was had become one of the default mediums, and any self-respecting modern gallery had at least a couple of video artists on their list. And that was actually quite important that happened, because it meant that there was the possibility of an economic life doing this kind of work. But probably the most important thing that happened, that was had to be there in order for anything to happen was the invention of the haze machine. In the 1970s, this work was visible. It was shown in old lofts, and they were full of dust. And in old lofts full of dust, people always smoked. We went to a new Kunsthalle in Malmö, or wherever, or a museum, and you had a clean, hygienic environment where smoking was prohibited, and there was no dust. And so almost overnight, as this work began to be shown, because it won a prize at a festival, Knop la Zoet, experimental film festival, and a lot of curators there, and it got to be known, and I got invitations to show in museums. But the trouble is, it was invisible once I got there. And so this was really, I think, one reason why it was so easy for me to, I thought, temporarily, to stop. I felt that I'd completed a body of work, and then only to find that it was, I'd probably made a very bad aesthetic error because the work was now invisible. Mm-hmm. And so the haze machine was very important. So, and then, you know, some personal stuff happened at the end of the 90s. I was getting quite tired of, by then I must have done about 200 art books, I think. I was mostly editing them by that time. And I worked, for instance, on all the Richard Serra books. And I decided to go back. And so I began by drawing for a couple of years. And then Chrissy Isles' exhibition happened about the same time as I was making my first new work. And that was, I mean, a huge piece of good luck in that, you know, 2 or 3 generations of artists who had never seen my work suddenly would see it. And then that was followed by 3 or 4 or 5 big historical surveys that happened in various countries in the world that were all, you know, all about uncovering this moment in the 60s and 70s when the moving image became disconnected from big cinema and became something in its own right. And so I, in a way, was a beneficiary of those excavations, and just lucky that I'd begun again. And so there was beginning to be an audience that was ready to look at the new work.
Yeah, yeah. This is, I mean, when you mentioned Richard Serra, but there was never the idea, for instance, even to conceive a work together.
No. But Richard came
I mean, evidently
he was one of the few. Yeah, he was. There are some aesthetic overlaps, I think. I like his work very much. And you know, he and Joan Jonas were the only artists from the main art world actually that came and looked at avant-garde cinema. They looked at film a lot, both of them. At that time, they were together. And,
but I mean, you've left avant-garde cinema, or have you not?
Well, you know, avant-garde cinema simply is a name of a sort of cultural institution in a way now. I mean, I don't think claims are being made for it in its heroic day. There were claims for that, but I mean, I think it just means a certain kind of filmmaking that's in a certain kind of context with a certain kind of non-funding. And you know, I think a lot of people that would once have made films for television or films. Commercial context have found a safe haven in the art world, and I think there's been a lot of migration, some migration from avant-garde cinema into the art world too. So it's a sort of the art world is a more open-ended structure than other institutions.
Yeah. And yeah. Perhaps you have some questions. Oh yeah.
Dan? Yeah.
Thank you so much, Anthony. Having seen it in 1975.
Yeah,
in a loft. I just want to say that what strikes me, of course, in seeing you talk about the work and seeing it in its representations here, because it really is a representation and not the work. There's a very rare combination of abstraction and sensuality. And I want you to talk a little bit about that combination, because I think it's really what makes the work come alive is the bringing of these two very kind of extreme positions together. So if you could talk a little bit about that.
Woohoo! It's a great question. Oh God, it's difficult to answer. Let's see. Well, you know what I mean. Let me just talk about one aspect of that, which is that which is obvious, really, which is about motion. You know, many people often say, "Oh, I mean, I get a lot of pressure to become a light artist," and I don't think I am one of those, whatever that is. You know, I think I'm dealing with cinema and sculptural issues, not light, really. Light's just my way of doing it. In any case, let's imagine that we just took one of these, one of the frames, and we made a slide, and we projected it to the scale of one of my solid light works. We used Hayes machine, everything, and there would be this giant, beautiful, volumetric form made of light. I think that after a few minutes, you would quickly tire of it. The beauty that people think they find in the forms made of light is actually not a function of the light, it's a function of the durational structure and the speed of motion. And I found, then talking of speed of motion, I found that slowness is a value. And it's a value really for very practical reasons. You know, if we watch a movie, our eyes and our minds are completely accustomed to high speed, things changing very fast. We can accommodate, we can hold together different storylines. We're really good at it now. Cinema has trained us. But these are not works of cinema like that. They're more like sculpture. And you can't, if you make a projected solid light piece move really fast, what happens is that the spectator stops dead in their tracks and stays rooted to the spot and waits and watches like you'd watch a soccer match. So in other words, it's the eye and the mind again, like watching a movie, and the body suddenly stopped working. And the thing about sculpture, it requires the body, that's the organ that's looking, if you like, is your own body in relation to this three-dimensional object. And so for sculptural behavior to be reinstated in this little model, we have to slow the motion down to such a degree that, as I would put it, you, the observer, is the fastest object in the room. And that generates emotion. And I can't exactly explain it, because as I said, I came to it for quite practical reasons. But it undoubtedly generates emotion, which people talk about in lots of different ways. Some people talk about spirituality, others talk about science fiction, others talk about just, you know, physical things. But there's no question that emotion comes from, I think it comes from the scale and the slowness. And of course, we mustn't forget we're in the dark, which is a crucial difference between this and, say, sculptural work, say, Richard Serra. You know, not only is there a 40-ton difference, but there's a difference between day and night, you know, between light and dark. I mean, that's sort of circling around it a bit, but...
May I just add one thing, because this is, I think it's very, it's because of this, the light projection, which is, of course is the abstraction, and we saw it here. I'm just now reminded there's this wonderful writing by Paul Klee back in the 20s, after Kandinsky, about the point and the line. And where Klee says, the point is not inert, it's zero movement. So it's becoming of the movement. And then 2 lines later, he speaks, and nobody really understood that today, and I think we'll not conclude tonight, is he says the point is of a cosmic orgasm. Klee says this, right? It's 27. And it is not becoming a line. And what you are having in this as we saw, this tangential structure, because the whole projection, once you see the projected, in fact becomes tangential. It's always touching. It's touching and leaving and meeting again. So it is in fact a very intimate structure, but which remains always within its own becoming. And this, for me at least, is this this very central emotional structure of the work. There were other questions. Oh, so you must see.
We're finding it out. Thank you, Anthony. I am embarrassed to admit, and thank you for your talk, to think, I've been thinking, somebody has really ripped off Anthony's idea. Because I went to an installation at Governor's Island that was incredible, that sounds a lot like Anthony's work. I'm delighted to hear it was your work. And it was an incredible experience. I believe Dan can back me up. I think this was the same weekend that there was a Civil War reenactment going on. And we went from the Civil War reenactment to seeing the art installations around Governor's Island. And I remember that we had trouble leaving your installation, which was an unusual experience for me in some ways. So I don't know if I have a question, but I guess my question is, in some ways, towards the end of your talk, you were talking about the specificity of the proposed light project in a community. And Dan over here was experiencing your art installation in the context of a 70s loft. And we experienced it in the context of an installation on Governor's Island, where in the context of the other art installations, which kind of invited you to move through the old buildings of Governor's Island, and your installation invited us to dwell and inhabit the space of those no longer used buildings. If I have a question, the question is, to what extent were you thinking about the specificity of Governor's Island in that context? First part. And second part, does that apply more globally in terms of where these, Hamburger Bun Wolf disused railroad station, the sort of...
They take place in... it's very usual for... because these need quite large spaces, and galleries don't usually have spaces of that sort of scale. And so there's often a lot of relationships developed between the gallery and different disused or little-used spaces. So I've done many of the big installations. Well, there was a big show at the Hamburger Bun Wolf in Milan. For those who know, that's an old turbine factory. It's massive. Governor's Island was a little-used chapel, just the right scale. I did a piece in the Round Chapel in Hackney, a disused church, again, oval-shaped. Let's see, Hamburger Bun Wolf was a disused railway station, as it were. What I would say about these spaces are that the works are very, very rarely, in fact, perhaps never, made for spaces. They are freestanding works that imagine a space of a certain scale. And then when one comes along, we can think about showing it there. The work is not site-specific usually, it's site-sensitive, which is to say the installations do vary a little bit according to the space. So, for instance, there was a monastery on Boulevard Saint-Germain, Paris, 12th century monastery. And I did an installation in the sacristy, which was roughly a cube, made of buttery limestone and arches, very, very beautiful. But it couldn't incorporate the work on the long axis of the two footprints. And for the very first time, I put them side by side, separated by an enormous Gothic column. And it worked extremely well, and I felt it was absolutely the work. I just hadn't done it in that way before. So those kinds of adjustments can take place. But they are essentially made in the studio.
There was two others.
Can I? Yes, so I have two questions, and they're the same question. You talked about making a lot of art but this is the inquiring minds want to know. You didn't tell us how you made the art. And I really am very curious about how you made the first cone, what the technique was to make the film. And looking at the more recent work, I'm guessing that computers are involved somehow, but it's a guess.
Yes.
So the two-part question is, what should I know about how these different projections have been made that would help me understand them? And the second part is there a reason why you didn't tell us in the first place?
Well, I'll answer the last part first, because, technique's only interesting if the work's interesting.
Bravo.
But simple question to answer the first part, which is line describing a cone, for instance, was one of 5 or 6 works that I made in the 70s. That was done using completely simple, completely ordinary, completely basic film animation, which is to say you put a drawing under a camera, which is mounted vertically, and under the camera is a bed which has many calibrations. You can rotate it, you can make it go left to right, you can make it go back to front, and of course the camera goes up and down. And you have a drawing and you have film in the camera, and you painstakingly, frame by frame, there are 24 frames a second for every second of movement, you cause the drawing to move in tiny, tiny degrees and shoot frame by frame to create the illusion of movement, because the great secret of cinema is there is no motion, only a set of stills. Each still is a little different from the previous one. And so animation is based on that little secret. And so I wasn't very good at it. The line scribe cone was the first time I had used animation. And, it's a little off. But actually so to fast forward now, yes, since in the last 10 years I've used digital animation. And I work with a programmer for whom I make, meticulous diagrams, measurements, and instructions, and then he writes the algorithm scripts, and it comes back to me, and then I spend a lot of time in the studio playing around with what I get, and changing it, in fact. This interesting thing about looking at the film pieces now, from the vantage point of the digital world, is how handmade they look. They look completely handmade. I mean, you notice, film looks handmade. It's got scratches and it wobbles. The frame edges aren't very sharp. The thing shakes a little bit. There are scratches. The line thickness that I drew so meticulously with a ruling pen turns out to not be even in thickness. And, you may do it digitally and you get sort of perfection of a sort. Except that the pixels create something very interesting. The stepped pixels on curved lines creates in longitudinal space striations, which actually I think are very beautiful. But anyway, so it's not perfect at all. There'll be another type of motion and animation, I'm sure in another 10 years, and God knows if it'll make what we're doing now look like. So it's a moving target, but there is that big difference between the film work made by hand with film animation and the digital work made on a computer.
Okay, last question is here, or
And
two
there's
questions.
one there, Ellen, too.
Last question.
Last 2 questions, yeah.
Okay, Anthony.
He can go on all night.
I can be really short. I'll be quick, I promise. That's just
Anthony.
Okay, sorry.
yeah.
My question, well, what I'm about to say may seem really obvious, so I apologize for it in advance. But you didn't talk about time, the experience of time in your work per se, because what struck me, having not had the good fortune of experiencing one of your installations, but watching this presentation was, I've never seen a more kind of radical way of describing
the experience of time through this combination of light and this kind of installation, right? And I'm wondering what you think, when you do something like this proposed bridge installation, which has this very different element for the observer, because the observer doesn't necessarily come every night, right, to see
No.
this.
Certainly not.
But in a community would be aware of it, over against someone coming to an exhibit, which is a very specific experience. How much you're trying to create just this radical sense, in the case of the stationary exhibits the installations of experiencing the present versus something like this, which is experiencing the passage of time. Does the temporal enter your conception? Or am I being so obvious
I think it's the fundamental medium I work in, actually. I mean, I think more than light, duration and temporal structure are really pretty much what I work with. And in the case of those public works, what interests me about public works in public spaces are that you have the possibility of an accidental spectator.
Right.
You go to a museum and you are an attentive observer. You're absorbed and you're there to be absorbed. But in a public space, you have no control over that. And what I actually like about Crossing the Hudson is the way it would inevitably, I think, embed itself in people's lives. I mean, your birthday will always, the bridge will always be lit a certain amount when it's your birthday.
Yeah.
There will have been a moment it was there when your mother died, and these things are inevitably built into something like that becomes part of the place. And I think that's a different experience of temporality and of time, really. But it's quite different from the more phenomenological one of being, in a museum and looking at a piece where you're really thinking about structure and all that. That's a different one. That's becoming part of your life. And it's a funny netherworld for art to be in a place where it's not really meant to be there. It's not part of things. It imposes itself and then gets embedded, or so I assume. I mean, this piece has not been made, but so I assume.
Last short question, which was there.
Anthony, thank you for such a generous presentation. I really appreciated your sharing the drawings and the models and your thinking about the work in such a complete way for all of us. That Civil War reenactment, it's an artwork. Just sort of an ironic kind of comment, but I see a lot of, having experienced the 70s avant-garde world myself, I see a lot of inflection from that time, even though the work has changed quite a bit. And I also saw the show at Hamburger Bun Wolf, which was stunning, and I had the pleasure of seeing it with a large group of art students from the School of the Art Institute, who were just completely taken with the work. But I keep thinking that the work, in the way that you describe it, as a space, as a social space, as a space where time slows down, I don't see the work in relation to architecture as much as in relation to the body and to choreography. And I know, during the 70s, there were a lot of very important choreographers, dancers that you were involved with. And I wondered if you could just speak briefly about the work in relation to the body.
I'm glad you
And
were
to
asking about the
dance.
relationships. Yes, perhaps the easiest way for me to talk about is to talk about a collaboration I had a couple of years ago with a choreographer. The first one I've ever done, actually, called Jonah Beaucaire, and he and I did a collaboration. My best kind of collaboration, which is we never had a discussion about what either of us were doing. So there was just an order to do things in, so I made a light grid of 36 light bulbs, which created the lighting for the piece, but also the bulbs were being illuminated in progressive sequences. You can guess how a little bit. And then that became the armature for his choreography. He took my time structure, the lighting and the set as his given, and he began his choreography. And we had absolutely no difficulty in, it was a very, very fruitful collaboration, in fact. As I'm talking, I'm aware I'm not answering your questions at all. But
were you influenced by those, Yvonne Rainer, Simone Forti, some of the people who were producing temporal works in time?
well, they were the two artists working in dance who I was most admiring of, and particularly the idea of something, instead of having to construct a dramatic moment, you simply decide a task that has to be executed, and the movements that your body goes through in order to execute the task becomes effectively the dance object. I think that's a very beautiful idea and still a very fruitful one. And I think knowing about that kind of work was liberating, because you had to get free of certain things like, well, you don't have to tell a story, you don't have to, it doesn't have to be in an oriental palace and with everyone with scimitars and turbans. It can be something really as simple as an ordinary task. And I think that was certainly somewhere lurking in the background of my early work.
We had the relation between Mary Wickman and Anthony McCall. There is a relation as well, but not tonight. Thank you very much, and wonderful. Thank you. Thank you.